In this video, we will talk about how to improve on the GRE verbal section. First off, let's think of the section. It's broken up into two brains. First off, there is your verbal brain. By that I mean vocabulary, the vocabulary you currently know, your reading skills, and active reading, which feeds into reading skills. Do you read actively? We will get to that in a moment. And of course, reading speed. So you can see that all three of these latter three, relate to reading, and the first relates to vocabulary. This is your existing verbal brain. So this existing verbal brain comes along and encounters something called the GRE verbal brain, which is slightly different. So you could be pretty strong at all of these, but if you first see a GRE question, you may be a little bit confused. So you want to get used to the question format. Getting used to it, you are growing your GRE verbal brain. Thinking like the GRE. That, of course, is very much a part of the GRE verbal brain. And finally, learning from your mistakes, and that feeds into thinking like the GRE. You will see how the test is structured, or at least you want to understand what makes a right answer right, and why the wrong answer, though pretty close, isn't actually right. And those skills are improving your GRE verbal brain. But before we get there, let's just start with the verbal brain in general. Ways to grow the verbal brain. We will start, of course, with improving vocabulary. Use flashcards. You hear it all the time, but they're very helpful. The thing is, I would not stop at flashcards. Vocabulary, learning vocabulary, that is an effort that takes many fronts. You want to attack this issue from as many places as you can. Using just one tool from your arsenal or from your toolbox, in this case flashcards, isn't enough. It's very much like a drug cocktail. You want to put together all the potent drugs to combat a disease. So, in this case, the disease is ignorance of GRE words, which is totally understandable because many of these words are very difficult. But if you start using these words in daily life, and if you start reading in general from certain sources, then your GRE vocabulary brain, or your vocabulary brain in general, will start growing. And this is important. So again, combine as many of these things as possible. Flashcards is a good base. Then there's reading skills. You may think, hey, I know how to read, but oftentimes we're reading stuff that's easy to read. We don't want to exert too much mental energy trying to decipher the meaning behind something. So read each day, but read outside your comfort zone. That's the key right there. It has to be a little bit challenging. It has to make you sweat. It shouldn't make you feel like you're completely out of your element and you have no idea what the author is talking about. Then back up a little and choose some reading material that is easier. Here are some great sources: New York Times, New Yorker, AL Daily, GRE passages themselves, for you to practice your reading skills. Start with something that isn't too challenging, but again, gets you outside your comfort zone. You may look at the New York Times or the New Yorker, and what you're looking for is not necessarily a sports post or the latest fashion updates, but something more along the lines of a 2 or 3 page article on the status of education, or what's going on right now with changes in the SAT, something like that. I mean, this is of course dry material, but it's relatively challenging and it shouldn't be outside your comfort zone. As you get stronger at reading, then you want to move on to something like aldaily.com, which is a site that pulls together academic writing from across the web. And finally, GRE passages themselves. Once you've read through them and done them under time constraints, it's always good to just go back and kind of read them a little bit more slowly and allow your brain to get used to the structure of the sentences, the way that arguments are developed. And if you do this often, your brain will get more comfortable with the GRE passages. Now, how to improve verbal also extends to something we talked about a little bit earlier, which was active reading. What do I mean by this? This may seem vague because when you read, aren't you sitting? Are you doing anything actively? Well, the answer to that is you are actually reading, or you should be reading actively. What I mean by that is you don't want to just string words together, which is something we often try to do when we are dealing with difficult text. We hope to make it to the end of the article or the piece, and we're thinking, oh, at the end I'll have this sudden eureka moment. But really, you stop reading, someone covers the page and asks you, hey, what did you read? And you're just really not sure. You say a few vague words, you maybe summarize the general topic, but you really don't know. And that's because you were not reading actively. So don't just string words together. Instead, think about what you read, pausing briefly, looking for patterns in what you read, noticing transitions between sentences, noticing what's the argument, what's the supporting point, anticipating all these things. That's what makes for great active reading. As for reading speed, you may think, oh, just string the words together faster. But when you do all these things, again, noting the argument structure or the way that the paragraph's developed, you can again anticipate things, and therefore you speed up because you're looking for these patterns of what they call chunking. And many of these GRE passages are organized in this predictable fashion so that they have these patterns. And soon, once you start chunking, you'll be able to absorb more in less time. Again, the key is this takes a little bit of time. So again, think about what you read, pause briefly. It's okay to go slow at first. You're building up a skill. With practice, you will become faster. And soon, you'll be getting a lot more than you were when you were just stringing words together. Now, we want to move on to the GRE verbal brain, which again was different because it's specific to the test. So you can read, you can know vocab, you can know all these things. I've never seen a GRE question before, so there is some getting used to the question format. Sometimes it's the strange wording or the academic level language that is employed in a reading comprehension passage or a text completion. So get used to that. Again, that can be probably filed under verbiage. The words, sometimes they seem like, wow, all these big words, so many of them, what do they all mean? You must get used to that, and that's where reading will help you. And learn the proper approach. This can basically be summed up as strategies and techniques. If you don't know any and you just head straight forward into a TC, that is text completion question, you can definitely feel like you are a fish out of water. So again, learning the proper techniques is very important to improving your GRE verbal brain. Next is this idea of making mistakes. And one way to improve the GRE verbal brain is to actually do just that. Because when you're making mistakes, you're realizing, wait a second, this is wrong because of A, B, and C. And so it's almost like a dialogue between you and the answer choices, trying to figure out what went wrong. But that is definitely improving your GRE verbal brain. You get to learn the familiar traps, the way that the GRE writes these questions, so of course you can anticipate them in the future. Now, we want to move on to another component of the GRE verbal brain, which is actually very closely related to that, and that is thinking like the GRE. How do they write these questions? And that flows very closely from what we were just talking about. And so to do this, more specifically, what makes a right answer right and a wrong answer wrong? And so you're not just going to go through an exercise and say, hey, I missed 3 of them. Let's see what happened. You're actually going to look over the ones that you got right as well, and you're going to say, well, was I ever torn between 2 answer choices? Why was I torn even though I got it right? Let's see what was so tempting about the answer choice that I almost picked. And so you're looking through all of the answer choices and trying to understand how they're put together, what makes this a weak answer choice weak, one that's tempting, not quite right, and of course what makes the right answer choice right, because this is how the GRE thinks, and to do well in the GRE, you too must be able to think like the GRE. And finally, the idea of pinpointing weak areas. So the GRE verbal contains many elements, and you want to find which one is the weakest link. Because if you develop these great reading skills, you learn to chunk, you're a brilliant active reader, you think like the GRE, yet you never really bothered to work too much on the vocabulary, then wait a second, you should stop with the reading comp, or at least cut it back a little in terms of the amount of time you spend on reading comp, and instead spend that time focused on vocab. Of course, that's just an example. Whatever that weakest link is, make sure you bring it up to the same level as the other skills that you need on the GRE verbal section.